The bullet that grazed Helena Oliver's shoulder on a dusty Montana road in 1875 changed everything, though she would not understand how much until weeks later when a mountain man with hands like oak branches would ask her to dance under a sky thick with stars. She had been riding in the back of her father's wagon when the outlaws struck, three masked men appearing from behind a cluster of boulders on the road between Bannack and Virginia City. Her father, Thomas Oliver, had reached for his rifle too slowly. The shot meant to kill him had torn through the canvas covering instead and caught Helena's shoulder as she crouched among the supplies they were transporting to their new home. The pain had been instant and overwhelming, a white-hot brand that made her vision swim. Her mother's scream still echoed in her memory weeks later. The outlaws had taken their money, most of their supplies, and her father's rifle before disappearing into the Montana wilderness like smoke. Thomas had managed to get them to Virginia City, where a stern-faced doctor named Phillips had cleaned and dressed Helena's wound. The injury would heal, he said, but it would take time. More time than they had, given that their funds were nearly depleted, and winter was approaching the mountains with predatory intent. That was how they ended up in Williams, Montana, a small settlement nestled in a valley between towering peaks that seemed to scrape the belly of heaven itself. Williams was not much to look at, just a main street of rough-hewn buildings, a general store, a saloon, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, and maybe 30 permanent residents who had staked their futures on the hope that the valley would yield enough to sustain them. But it was affordable, and Thomas Oliver had found work at the lumber mill on the edge of town. Helena's mother, Margaret, had taken in sewing and mending to supplement their income. Helena herself had recovered slowly from the gunshot wound, the injury leaving her right shoulder stiff and prone to aching when the weather turned cold. At 22 years old, she found herself in a strange new place where everyone seemed to know everyone else, where she was the newcomer with the haunted eyes and the careful way of moving that spoke of recent pain. She helped her mother with the sewing, worked in the small garden behind their rented cabin, and tried not to notice how the other young women in Williams seemed to glide through life with an ease she had never mastered. Helena had always been quiet, more comfortable with books than people, more likely to observe than participate. Even before the shooting, even back in their previous home in Wyoming Territory where she had grown up, she had been the girl who stood at the edges of social gatherings, who watched others dance at barn raisings and community celebrations, but never joined in herself. No one had ever asked her. She told herself it did not matter, that dancing was frivolous anyway, but there were nights when she lay awake and wondered what it might feel like to be chosen, to be seen as worth asking. The summer of 1876 brought prosperity to Williams. The lumber mill expanded, bringing new workers to town. The general store received regular shipments of goods from Virginia City. There was talk of eventually getting a telegraph line, though most folks agreed that was probably years away if it happened at all. The town felt alive with possibility, and even Helena found herself cautiously optimistic about their future there. She was working in the garden on a Thursday afternoon in late July when she first heard about the mountain man. Her neighbor, a talkative woman named Mrs. Donnelly, who had opinions about everything and everyone, leaned over the fence separating their properties and launched into the story without preamble. "There is a man up in the high country," Mrs. Donnelly said, her eyes bright with the pleasure of sharing fresh gossip. "Lives up there year-round, they say. Comes down maybe twice a year to trade furs and buy supplies. Ezekiel Morris at the general store says the man brought in a load of pelts yesterday that were the finest he had seen in 5 years. Beaver Fox, even a mountain lion skin that was near perfect. Helena continued pulling weeds from around the bean plants, only half listening. Mountain men were not uncommon in Montana territory. Many preferred the solitude of the high country to the complications of town living. "They say he is huge," Mrs. Donnelly continued, warming to her subject. "Tall as a tree and strong enough to wrestle a bear. Long hair down past his shoulders, though Ezekiel says he keeps it tied back neat. Name is Dalton something. Dalton Jennings, I think." "That is interesting," Helena said, though her tone suggested it was anything but. Mrs. Donnelly huffed. "You young people have no appreciation for a good story. Anyway, he apparently has a cabin up near Tobacco Root Creek, way up where the snow does not fully melt even in August. Can you imagine living up there all alone with just the animals and the weather for company?" Helena could imagine it, actually. The solitude sounded peaceful rather than lonely, but she kept that thought to herself. The next day, she had reason to revise her disinterest in Mrs. Donnelly's gossip. Helena had gone to the general store to purchase thread for her mother, and a small bag of coffee beans that Margaret Oliver doled out with miserly care to make them last. The store was dim after the bright sunshine outside, and it took her eyes a moment to adjust. When they did, she found herself staring at the man standing at the counter. Mrs. Donnelly had not exaggerated. Dalton Jennings was enormous, easily 6.5 feet tall with shoulders so broad they seemed to fill the narrow aisle. He wore buckskin trousers and a homespun shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle. His hair was indeed long, a dark brown shot through with lighter streaks from the sun, and tied back with a leather cord. His face was weathered and tanned, his jaw covered with several days' worth of beard. He looked like he had been carved from the mountains themselves, all hard edges and raw strength. Helena froze just inside the doorway. The man was examining a new axe head, turning it over in hands that made the tool look small. Ezekiel Morris hovered nearby, practically wringing his hands with eagerness to make a sale. "This is good steel," Dalton said. His voice was deep and rough, like stones grinding together but not unpleasant. "From back east, Pittsburgh," Ezekiel confirmed. "Finest quality that will last you 20 years if you care for it properly." Dalton nodded and set the axe head on the counter along with several other items. Salt, flour, sugar, a new whetstone, needles and thread, ammunition for what must be a large-caliber rifle. He paid in cash from a leather pouch, and Helena noticed his movements were deliberate and careful, as if he was conscious of his size in the confined space. She tried to slip past him to reach the shelves at the back of the store, but the aisle was narrow, and he turned at the same moment she moved. They nearly collided. Helena stumbled back, her shoulder bumping the shelf behind her. Pain flared from her old injury and she gasped involuntarily. Dalton's hand shot out to steady her, his grip on her good arm gentle despite the obvious strength behind it. "Careful," he said, his dark eyes meeting hers with concern. "Are you hurt?" "I am fine," Helena managed, though the ache in her shoulder suggested otherwise. "I apologize. I should have waited." He released her arm immediately and stepped back to give her more room. "No need to apologize, miss. I take up more space than most." There was no self-pity in his tone, just a statement of fact, up close. She could see that his eyes were a deep brown, almost black, with small lines at the corners that suggested he smiled more than his serious expression might indicate. He smelled of pine smoke and leather and something else she could not quite identify, something clean and wild like the mountain air itself. "Are you certain you are all right?" he asked when she did not move. "Yes, thank you." She squeezed past him. intensely aware of the warmth radiating from his body in the small space, and hurried to the back of the store. Her hands trembled slightly as she selected the thread and coffee. She was being ridiculous. He was just a man, a stranger who would complete his business and return to his mountain cabin, and probably never come to town again for months. There was no reason for her heart to be pounding like a drum or for her face to feel so warm. When she returned to the counter, he was gone. Ezekiel was stacking his purchases in a crate, humming tunelessly. "That was him," Ezekiel said when he noticed Helena. "The mountain man everyone has been talking about, Dalton Jennings. Polite fellow for someone who spends most of his time alone." "He seemed very nice," Helena said neutrally, placing her items on the counter. "He asked about you," Ezekiel added, his eyes gleaming with interest. Helena's stomach flipped. "What?" "Asked who you were, how long you had been in town." "I told him about your family coming here last fall, about your father working at the mill." Ezekiel wrapped her thread and coffee in brown paper. He listened real careful-like, then nodded and went on his way. Helena paid for her purchases and left the store, her mind spinning. Why would a mountain man she had barely spoken to ask about her? It made no sense. She tried to push the encounter from her thoughts as she walked home, but Dalton Jennings's face kept surfacing in her memory, those dark eyes and the unexpected gentleness in his touch when he had steadied her. The summer days passed in their usual rhythm. Helena helped her mother with sewing orders, tended the garden, occasionally went to church services on Sundays. She did not see Dalton Jennings again, and she told herself she was not disappointed. She had no reason to expect to see him. Men like that belonged to the wilderness, not to small towns and social conventions. August arrived with warm days and cool nights. The crops in the valley were growing well, and there was talk of a celebration in town to mark the end of summer before the hard work of harvest began. Helena listened to the plans with detached interest. There would be food and music and dancing, the same as there had been at similar celebrations in Wyoming. She would attend because her parents would expect it, and she would stand on the sidelines and watch others enjoy themselves, and she would try not to mind. The celebration was set for the first Saturday in September. Mrs. Donnelly informed everyone within earshot that her husband would be playing fiddle, and that there had better be enough young people willing to dance, or what was the point of having music at all? She looked meaningfully at Helena when she said this, as if Helena's lack of dancing was a personal affront. Helena spent the day of the celebration helping her mother prepare food to contribute to the communal meal. Margaret had made her specialty, an apple pie with a lattice crust that always drew compliments. Helena had baked bread and prepared a pot of beans with salt pork. Simple food, but filling and well made. They arrived at the town center as the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that made the mountains look like they were on fire. Someone had built a bonfire in the open area between the general store and the church, and makeshift tables had been set up for the food. Children ran between the buildings, their laughter high and bright. The men gathered in clusters, smoking and talking about timber prices and weather. The women arranged food and gossiped, their voices a steady hum. Helena helped set out their contributions, and then retreated to a spot near the church steps where she could observe without being too obviously alone. Her mother tried to draw her into conversation with some of the other young women, but Helena demurred, claiming she was tired. It was not entirely a lie. Social gatherings exhausted her in a way that physical labor never did. The music started as twilight deepened into true night. Mr. Donnelly's fiddle was joined by a guitar played by one of the mill workers and a harmonica contributed by old Samuel Watts, who claimed he had learned to play during the war. The combination was lively and surprisingly good. People began to dance, forming sets in the firelight. Helena watched the swirl of skirts and the stamp of boots on the hard, packed earth, and felt the familiar ache of exclusion settle over her like a shawl. She was so focused on the dancers that she did not notice the man approaching until he was standing directly in front of her, blocking her view. She looked up, startled, and found herself staring at Dalton Jennings. He looked different than he had in the general store. He had trimmed his beard and his hair was freshly washed, still tied back but gleaming in the firelight. He wore clean clothes, the same buckskin trousers but a newer shirt that fit snugly across his broad chest and shoulders. He held his hat in his hands and looked uncharacteristically nervous. "Miss Oliver," he said, his deep voice barely audible over the music and laughter. "I hope I am not disturbing you." "Not at all," Helena said, her own voice sounding strange to her ears. "I did not expect to see you here, Mr. Jennings. I heard there was a celebration, thought I would come down and see it." He shifted his weight, and Helena realized with astonishment that he was uncomfortable. This huge mountain man who wrestled bears or whatever he did in the high country was nervous about talking to her. "I was hoping I might ask you something." "Of course." He cleared his throat. "Would you dance with me, Miss Oliver?" The world seemed to stop. The music faded to a distant buzz. The firelight and the stars and the mountains all blurred together. Helena stared at him, unable to process what he had just asked. "I know I am not much for social gatherings," Dalton continued, apparently interpreting her silence as reluctance. "And I am out of practice with dancing, probably will step on your feet, but I would be honored if you would give me a chance." "I do not know how," Helena blurted out, the truth escaping before she could think better of it. "I have never danced. No one ever asked me before." Something shifted in his expression, a softening around his eyes. "Then we can learn together," he said simply. He held out his hand, and Helena saw that it was trembling slightly. "What do you say, Miss Oliver?" She looked at his hand, large and calloused and scarred from a life lived rough and hard. She thought about all the times she had stood on the edges of celebrations like this one, watching and wishing. She thought about the bullet that had torn through her shoulder and the months of pain that followed, and how she had decided that her life would always be small and cautious and safe. She took his hand. His fingers closed around hers with surprising gentleness, and he led her toward the dancers. Helena's heart hammered so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. Her legs felt unsteady, and the old injury in her shoulder throbbed with tension. "Don't worry," Dalton said softly for her ears alone. "I have got you." They reached the edge of the dancing area, and Dalton turned to face her. The current dance was winding down, and the musicians transitioned into something slower, a waltz that made several of the couples on the floor shift their positions to accommodate the new rhythm. "Put your hand on my shoulder," Dalton instructed. "Your other hand in mine." "I will put my hand on your waist if that is all right." Helena nodded, not trusting her voice. She placed her left hand on his shoulder, feeling the solid muscle beneath the fabric of his shirt. Her right hand he took in his left, his grip warm and secure. When his right hand settled on her waist, she felt the heat of it through her dress, anchoring her. "Now we just move with the music," he said. "Follow my lead. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. They began to move, and Helena immediately stepped on his foot. "I am sorry," she gasped. "It is all right. Try again." They did, and this time she managed 3 full counts before stumbling. Dalton steadied her, patient and unhurried. They tried again, and again. Slowly, hesitantly, Helena began to feel the rhythm of the music, to understand how her body could move in relation to his. Dalton guided her with gentle pressure on her waist, his hand in hers leading without forcing. "That is it. he said encouragingly. "You are doing fine." They were not moving as gracefully as the other dancers, and Helena was intensely aware of the eyes watching them, but Dalton did not seem to notice or care. His focus was entirely on her, his dark eyes watching her face as if nothing else in the world mattered. "Why did you ask me?" Helena heard herself say. "Because you looked like you wanted to dance, but nobody was asking." His answer was direct and honest. "And because I have thought about you since that day in the store. Seemed like maybe you were thinking about me too, or hoping I was foolish." "I thought about you," Helena admitted, feeling her cheeks flush. He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his serious face into something warm and open. "Good. That makes me feel less foolish." They danced through that song and into the next, and gradually Helena found herself relaxing into the movement. Dalton had been right about stepping on feet he did, once, and apologized profusely, until she laughed, and told him she had done it to him at least a dozen times already. The sound of her own laughter surprised her. When the musicians took a break, Dalton led her away from the firelight to a quieter spot near the edge of town. The stars overhead were brilliant, the Milky Way a river of light across the black sky. The mountains rose around them like sleeping giants. "Thank you for dancing with me," Helena said, suddenly shy now that they were alone. "Thank you for saying yes." Dalton still held her hand, his thumb absently rubbing across her knuckles. "Can I ask what happened to your shoulder? I noticed you favoring it in the store and again while we were dancing." Helena hesitated, then told him about the robbery, the gunshot, the slow recovery. He listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker as she spoke. "I am sorry that happened to you," he said when she finished. "People can be cruel. It could have been worse. I survived. You did more than survive. You are here. You are living." He seemed to choose his words carefully. "That takes courage." No one had ever called her courageous before. The words settled into her chest like a warm coal. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, and then Dalton said, "I should tell you something, Miss Oliver. I am not good with words or social niceties. I spend most of my time alone in the mountains because that is the life I chose after coming back from the war. I saw things in those years that made me not want to be around people much anymore. But then I saw you in the store, and something shifted. You looked at me like I was just a man, not some curiosity or someone to be frightened of. I would like to know you better if you are willing." "I am willing," Helena said, the words coming easier than she expected. "But I should warn you I am not good with social situations either. I prefer books and gardens to parties. I am quiet and probably boring." "You are not boring," Dalton said firmly, "and I like quiet." The musicians started playing again, and Dalton looked toward the sound, then back at Helena. "One more dance before I have to head back up the mountain." "Yes," Helena said. "Yes, I would like that." They danced again under the stars, and this time Helena felt almost confident in her movements. Dalton held her close enough that she could feel the steady beat of his heart, and she thought about how strange and wonderful it was that a few words and an extended hand could change everything. When the celebration began to wind down and families started gathering their children and their belongings to head home, Dalton walked Helena back to her parents. Thomas Oliver looked surprised to see the mountain man accompanying his daughter, but he shook Dalton's hand when introduced and thanked him for seeing Helena home safely. "I would like to call on your daughter, Mr. Oliver," Dalton said. "With your permission." Thomas exchanged a glance with Margaret, who had been watching the entire interaction with barely concealed interest. "Where exactly do you live, Mr. Jennings?" "Up near Tobacco Root Creek, sir. I have a cabin there. I trap and hunt, sell furs and meat. It is a solitary life, but a good one." "That is quite a distance from town," Thomas said carefully. "It is," Dalton agreed, but I can come down more frequently, every week or two if Miss Oliver would like." "Helena," Thomas turned to his daughter. "What do you think?" Helena felt all eyes on her parents, Dalton, even Mrs. Donnelly, who had suddenly appeared nearby and was shamelessly eavesdropping. A few months ago, she would have demurred, made an excuse, protected herself from the possibility of disappointment or hurt. But tonight she had danced for the first time in her life. Tonight she had felt seen and chosen. Tonight she had been brave. "I would like that very much," she said, looking directly at Dalton. His smile was worth every ounce of courage the words had cost her. True to his word, Dalton came down from the mountains every week or two throughout the autumn. He would arrive in town in the morning, conduct whatever business he needed at the general store or the mill, and then spend the afternoon with Helena. They took long walks around the valley, Dalton pointing out animal tracks and teaching her to read the land the way he did. They sat on the porch of her parents' cabin and talked about everything and nothing: his experiences in the war, her love of books, their hopes for the future, the small details of daily life that take on significance when shared with someone who cares. Helena discovered that Dalton had been a soldier in the Union Army, that he had fought at Gettysburg and Antietam, and half a dozen other battles, whose names still appeared in newspapers and history books. He did not talk much about the fighting itself, but she understood that he had seen friends die, had killed men himself, and had come west afterward seeking peace in the wilderness. "The mountains do not judge," he told her during one of their walks in late October, the aspens turning gold around them. "They just exist. There is something healing about that." "Do you ever get lonely?" Helena asked. "I used to think I preferred it," Dalton admitted. "Being alone meant no one could disappoint me or leave. But now I think I was just waiting to meet the right person to not be alone with anymore. And you think I might be that person?" Helena's heart was in her throat. "I know you are," he said simply. He took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. "I love you, Helena Oliver. I think I started loving you the moment you looked at me in the general store without fear or judgment, just honest curiosity. I know I am rough around the edges and not the kind of man most women would choose. I know my life is hard and isolated and not full of comforts. But if you could see your way to—" Helena stopped walking and turned to face him. "I love you too," she interrupted. "I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. You make me want to be braver, to try new things, to stop standing on the sidelines of my own life. So yes, whatever you were going to ask, yes." Dalton laughed, a sound of pure joy that echoed off the mountains. He picked her up and spun her in a circle, and Helena shrieked with surprise and delight. When he set her down, he kissed her for the first time, his lips gentle despite the urgency she could feel thrumming through his body. The kiss tasted like possibility and promise, and when they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. "I was going to ask if you would marry me," Dalton said, "but I did not want to rush you." "Yes," Helena said again. "Yes, I will marry you." They were married in November, just before the heavy snows closed the mountain passes. The ceremony was held in the church in Williams, with most of the town attending out of curiosity as much as goodwill. Helena wore a dress her mother had sewn for the occasion, simple but beautiful, and she carried a bouquet of the last wildflowers of the season that Dalton had gathered from the high meadows. He wore his best clothes and had trimmed his hair and beard, though he still looked wild and untamed compared to the townsmen in their Sunday suits. When the preacher asked if they would take each other, their voices rang out clear and certain. And when Dalton kissed his bride, there was a smattering of applause and more than a few sighs from the unmarried women who had secretly hoped the mountain man might notice them. The question of where they would live had been settled over several long discussions. Helena had never been to Dalton's cabin, but she trusted his descriptions of it. It was sturdy, he said, built to withstand the brutal mountain winters. It had a good fireplace and a cache for storing food. It was isolated, yes, but he would teach her everything she needed to know about surviving in the high country. And they could come down to Williams every few weeks to visit her parents and maintain connections to the town. Thomas and Margaret had concerns, of course. What if Helena could not handle the isolation? What if something happened and they could not get help quickly? What if Dalton's cabin was not as sturdy as he claimed? But Helena had made her choice, and they respected it. Margaret packed preserves and dried goods for them to take up the mountain. Thomas pressed a small pistol into Helena's hand and made her promise to practice with it until she could hit a target consistently. "You will be far from help," Thomas said gruffly. "I need to know you can protect yourself if something happens." Helena hugged her father tightly. "I will write letters," she promised, "and we will visit often." They left Williams 2 days after the wedding, riding up into the mountains on Dalton's 2 horses, their supplies packed carefully to balance the weight. The journey took the better part of a day, following trails that became increasingly narrow and steep as they climbed. Helena saw elk grazing in distant meadows, watched an eagle soar overhead, felt the air grow thinner and colder as they ascended. Dalton's cabin appeared in the late afternoon, nestled in a small valley with a creek running nearby. It was larger than Helena had expected, built from massive logs chinked with mud and moss. Smoke rose from the stone chimney, evidence that Dalton had left a fire burning when he had come down to town for the wedding. "Home," Dalton said, dismounting and helping Helena down from her horse. He looked nervous again, the way he had the night he had asked her to dance. "It is not much, but it is warm and dry." Helena walked to the cabin door and pushed it open. The interior was dim, lit only by the low fire in the hearth, but as her eyes adjusted she took in the details. A large bed in one corner, covered with furs and wool blankets. A table and 2 chairs, both handmade but well crafted. Shelves holding dishes, supplies, traps, and tools. Hooks on the walls for coats and gear. A rocking chair near the fireplace. It was sparse but clean, organized but comfortable. A bachelor's home, but one maintained by someone who took pride in his space. "It is perfect," Helena said, and meant it. Dalton let out a breath she had not realized he was holding. "Really, really." She turned to him and took his hands. "This is our home now. We will make it perfect together." They spent the rest of the afternoon unloading supplies and settling Helena's few possessions into the cabin. Dalton showed her where everything was kept, how the fireplace drew best, where he stored the preserved meat and vegetables that would see them through the winter. He pointed out the creek where they could get water, the small structure he used for smoking meat, the areas around the cabin where he had set trap lines. That night, they lay together in the big bed under layers of furs, and Dalton held Helena close to his chest. Through the window, she could see stars so bright and numerous they seemed unreal. The creek provided a constant, soothing burble in the background. "Are you frightened?" Dalton asked softly. "Being up here, so far from everything you know?" "No," Helena said, and realized it was true. "I feel safe with you. I feel like I am exactly where I am supposed to be." He kissed the top of her head. "I will spend every day of the rest of my life making sure you never regret this choice." "I know you will." The winter that followed tested Helena in ways she had not anticipated. The snow started falling in earnest in late November and did not stop for days. Drifts piled up around the cabin, sometimes nearly to the windows. The cold was sharp and unforgiving, the kind that made exposed skin burn within seconds. Dalton checked his trap lines every few days, sometimes staying out for hours in weather that Helena could barely imagine enduring. but the cabin was warm, and they had plenty of supplies. Dalton taught Helena to cure hides, to make pemmican, to maintain the traps and snares. She taught him to read better. He had the basics, but had never had much formal schooling, and they spent long evenings by the fire working through the books she had brought from Williams. She read aloud to him from adventure stories and poetry collections, and he listened with absolute focus, sometimes interrupting to ask questions or comment on a passage that struck him. They made love often, learning each other's bodies with the same careful attention they brought to everything else. Dalton was always gentle despite his size and strength, always attentive to Helena's pleasure as much as his own. She marveled at how safe she felt with him, how his touch could make her forget the old ache in her shoulder, how his presence filled the spaces inside her that had been empty for so long. In February, a blizzard swept through the mountains with terrifying ferocity. The wind howled like a living thing, and snow fell so thickly that Helena could not see the creek just 30 yards from the cabin door. They were trapped inside for 4 days, the drifts piling so high against the walls that Dalton had to dig them out when the storm finally passed. "This is the worst I have seen in 5 years," he admitted, surveying the transformed landscape. Everything was buried under feet of white, the familiar contours of the valley erased. "We are all right, though. We have food and fuel, we just have to wait it out." Helena helped him dig paths from the cabin to the creek and the smokehouse. The physical labor was exhausting, but she was stronger now than she had been when they married. Months of mountain life had built muscle and endurance she had not known she possessed. Her shoulders still ached sometimes, especially in the cold, but it no longer limited her the way it once had. Spring arrived late and reluctantly, the snow finally melting in April to reveal the valley beneath. The creek swelled with runoff, and wildflowers began to emerge from the soggy ground. Dalton and Helena made their first trip down to Williams since before the heavy snows, riding carefully on trails that were muddy and treacherous. Her parents were overjoyed to see them, though Margaret cried when she saw how thin Helena had become over the winter. "We had enough food," Helena assured her. "It is just hard work up there. I am healthy, I promise." They spent 3 days in town, visiting with family, purchasing supplies, catching up on news and gossip. Mrs. Donnelly informed them that 2 new families had arrived over the winter, that there was talk of building a proper school, and that Helena's former neighbor had gotten engaged to one of the mill workers. "And when can we expect news of a baby?" Mrs. Donnelly asked with her typical lack of subtlety. Helena blushed but smiled. "Not yet, but we are hopeful." The truth was that Helena had wondered herself if she might be pregnant. Her courses had been irregular since the wedding, but Dalton had told her that was common for women adjusting to the altitude and the physical demands of mountain life. Still, she hoped. She wanted children, wanted to fill the cabin with laughter and love, wanted to give Dalton the family he had never talked about wanting but she knew he would treasure. Summer in the high country was brief but glorious. The meadows exploded with color, and the days stretched long and bright. Dalton taught Helena to fish in the creek and the higher lakes. They harvested wild berries and preserved them for the next winter. They made love under the stars on warm nights, and Helena thought she had never been so happy. It was in August that she finally confirmed what she had begun to suspect. Her courses had stopped entirely, and she was exhausted in a way that felt different from simple physical tiredness. Her breasts were tender, and certain smells made her nauseous. She waited until she was certain before telling Dalton, afraid of disappointing him if she was wrong. They were sitting outside the cabin one evening, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of pink and gold, when Helena finally found the courage to speak. "I am with child," she said simply. I think I am about 3 months along. Dalton went very still. Then he turned to look at her, his eyes searching her face. Are you certain? As certain as I can be without a doctor examining me. How do you feel? Are you well? Is there anything wrong? I feel tired and a bit sick sometimes, but I think that is normal. Dalton, are you happy about this? He pulled her into his arms so tightly she squeaked in protest. Happy does not even begin to cover it, he said, his voice rough with emotion. A child, our child. Helena, you have given me everything. We gave it to each other, she corrected, but she was smiling through tears. They made the trip down to Williams in September so that Dr. Phillips could examine Helena and confirm the pregnancy. He estimated the baby would arrive in late February or early March, right at the tail end of winter. He also warned them that Helena should probably be in town for the birth, given that complications could arise that would require immediate medical attention. I do not want to be away from the cabin for months, Helena said as they rode back up the mountain, but I also do not want to take unnecessary risks with the baby. We will figure it out, Dalton promised. Maybe we can come down to town in late January and stay with your parents until after the baby is born. I do not like being away from the cabin that long either, but nothing is more important than you and our child being safe. They settled into a new routine over the autumn. Dalton was more protective than ever, insisting that Helena not overexert herself, that she rest frequently, that she eat more even when she did not feel hungry. Helena tolerated his hovering with amused patience, knowing it came from a place of love and fear. He had lost people in the war, she knew. The thought of losing her or their child terrified him. Her body changed as the baby grew. Her belly rounded, and she felt the first flutters of movement in late October. The sensation was strange and wondrous, like tiny bubbles or the brush of butterfly wings against her skin from the inside. When she told Dalton, he placed his large hand on her belly and waited with absolute stillness until he felt a kick against his palm. His expression was one of pure awe. They left for Williams in mid-January, reluctantly locking up the cabin and making the long, cold journey down the mountain. Helena was 6 months pregnant by then, her belly large enough that mounting and dismounting the horse required Dalton's assistance. Her parents had prepared a room for them, and Dr. Phillips checked on Helena every few days. Everything looks good, he reported each time. The baby is growing well, and your heartbeat is strong. Just rest and stay warm. Helena found the enforced idleness difficult. She was used to being active, to contributing. Margaret put her to work sewing baby clothes and blankets, and Helena threw herself into the task with determination. Dalton helped at the lumber mill when he could, needing something to do with his hands and energy. February arrived with more snow and bitter cold. Helena grew increasingly uncomfortable as the baby pressed on her lungs and bladder. Her back ached constantly, and she could not find a comfortable position to sleep. Dalton held her at night, rubbing her lower back and whispering reassurances when she cried from frustration and discomfort. The baby came on a Tuesday in late February, 3 days after a snowstorm dumped another foot of powder on the town. Helena's water broke in the middle of the night, and the contractions started shortly after. Dalton ran through the dark streets to fetch Dr. Phillips while Margaret stayed with Helena, helping her through the early stages of labor. The birth was long and difficult. Helena labored all through the morning and into the afternoon, the pain coming in relentless waves that left her gasping and exhausted. Dalton held her hand, his face pale with worry, helpless in the face of her suffering. "I cannot do this," Helena sobbed during a particularly brutal contraction. "You can," Dalton said fiercely. "You are the strongest person I know. You can do this." "I need you," she managed. "I am right here. I am not going anywhere." Finally, as the sun was setting and Helena thought she could not endure another moment, the baby crowned. Dr. Phillips guided her through the final pushes, and then suddenly there was a new sound in the room, a baby's cry, high and indignant and perfect. "A boy," Dr. Phillips announced, holding up the squalling infant. "You have a son." Helena collapsed back against the pillows, tears streaming down her face. Dalton was crying too, she realized. The huge mountain man who had survived a war and years alone in the wilderness was weeping as he looked at his newborn son. The baby was cleaned and wrapped in blankets and placed in Helena's arms. He was small and red and wrinkled, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that would probably turn brown like his father's. He stopped crying when Helena held him, his tiny face turning toward her instinctively. "Hello," Helena whispered. "Hello, little one, we have been waiting for you." Dalton touched the baby's head with one large finger, his hand trembling. "He is perfect." "What will you name him?" Margaret asked, hovering nearby with obvious eagerness. Helena and Dalton had discussed names during the long winter months, but now that the moment was here, Helena found she wanted something that acknowledged their unique journey. "I was thinking David," she said. "After my grandfather, David Jennings." "David," Dalton repeated, testing the name. "I like that. David Jennings. Our son." They stayed in Williams for 6 weeks after the birth, giving Helena time to recover and David time to grow a bit before they attempted the journey back to the cabin. Dalton was a devoted father, getting up with Helena during the night feedings, changing diapers without complaint, spending hours simply watching the baby sleep. He seemed perpetually amazed that this tiny person existed, that he was responsible for protecting and raising him. "I never thought I would have this," Dalton admitted one night as they lay in bed with David sleeping in a cradle nearby. "A family, a wife and child who love me. It seemed like something other people got to have, not men like me." "What do you mean, men like you?" Helena asked. "Damaged, haunted." "Men who have killed and seen death and cannot always sleep through the night without nightmares." Helena took his hand and placed it over her heart. "You are a good man, Dalton Jennings, the best man I have ever known. You are gentle and kind and strong and loving. David is lucky to have you as a father. I am lucky to have you as a husband." "I love you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I love you both more than I thought it was possible to love anything." They returned to the cabin in early April when the trails were finally clear enough to travel safely. Helena rode with David bundled against her chest, and Dalton led both horses carefully up the mountain paths. The valley was beginning to green with new growth, and the creek was running high and fast with snowmelt. The cabin looked exactly as they had left it, though a family of mice had taken up residence in their absence. Dalton evicted them efficiently while Helena settled David in the cradle he had spent weeks building during the winter. It was made from wood he had carefully selected and sanded until it was smooth as glass, with intricate carvings of animals and trees along the sides. Life in the cabin took on a new rhythm with a baby. David was remarkably good-natured, but he still woke frequently during the night and demanded attention throughout the day. Helena was exhausted in a way she had never experienced before, a bone-deep weariness that sleep never quite erased. But she had also never felt so purposeful, so needed and necessary. Dalton did everything he could to help, taking David for long stretches so Helena could rest, checking his trap lines early in the morning so he could be back to assist with the baby. He sang to David in a surprisingly pleasant baritone, songs from his childhood, and made up tunes about mountains and animals. David seemed to respond to his father's voice, his tiny face turning toward the sound, his eyes now definitely brown tracking Dalton's movements. Summer brought another change. Helena discovered she was pregnant again. She had not expected it to happen so soon after David's birth, but Dalton's laughter when she told him echoed off the mountain peaks. "We are going to have a houseful," he said, spinning her carefully in a circle before remembering she was pregnant and setting her down quickly. "Are you happy? Is this all right?" "I am happy," Helena assured him. "Tired and a bit overwhelmed, but happy." Their second child, a daughter they named Hope, was born the following March. This birth was easier than David's, and Hope was a quieter baby, content to observe the world with solemn blue eyes that gradually turned green like Helena's. Dalton was just as devoted to his daughter as he was to his son, and watching him with both children made Helena fall in love with him all over again. The years flowed into each other, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their children. David grew into a sturdy boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's quiet thoughtfulness. Hope was more outgoing, chattering constantly once she learned to talk, demanding stories and attention. They had another child 3 years after Hope, a son they named Matthew, who proved to be adventurous and fearless, giving his parents constant heart attacks with his climbing and exploring. The cabin expanded over the years. Dalton built an addition with a second bedroom for the children, then another room for storage. He constructed a proper barn for their growing number of horses and goats. He cleared and fenced a garden area where Helena grew vegetables to supplement their diet of game meat and wild plants. They made trips to Williams several times a year, their visits eagerly anticipated by Helena's parents and the townspeople who had come to see the Jennings family as local legends. The shy girl who had never danced and the mountain man who had swept her off her feet were a romantic story the town loved to tell, and their children were welcomed and spoiled by everyone. Helena taught David and Hope and Matthew to read and write, using the books she had brought from Williams and others they acquired on trips to town. Dalton taught them to track animals, to read weather signs, to survive in the wilderness. The children grew up as comfortable in the mountains as most children were in towns, able to navigate the forests and meadows with confidence. There were hard times, too. A particularly brutal winter when they nearly ran out of food and Dalton had to make dangerous trips through blizzards to check trap lines. A summer when forest fires swept through a distant valley, filling the air with smoke for weeks. The year Hope developed a fever that frightened them both until it finally broke. The constant worry about injuries or illness when they were so far from medical help, but the good times far outweighed the bad. Nights gathered around the fire, Dalton telling stories while Helena mended clothes and the children listened with rapt attention. Summer days exploring the high meadows, picking wildflowers and watching the clouds. Teaching the children to fish in the creek, to ride horses, to appreciate the vast beauty of the world they lived in. And through it all, the love between Helena and Dalton deepened and matured. They learned to communicate without words, to anticipate each other's needs, to support each other through challenges, and celebrate victories together. They made time for each other despite the demands of raising children in the wilderness, stealing moments to walk together in the evenings or sit together after the children were asleep. One summer evening when David was 8, Hope was 5, and Matthew was 2, Dalton asked Helena to come outside with him after the children were in bed. She followed him to the clearing in front of the cabin, where the stars were just beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "Do you remember the night we first danced?" Dalton asked. "Of course I do. How could I forget? I was thinking we should do it again." He held out his hand, the gesture so familiar and beloved after all these years. "Dance with me, Helena." There was no music except the night sounds the creek, an owl calling in the distance, the wind through the pines. But Helena took his hand and let him pull her close, and they moved together in the starlight, swaying to a rhythm only they could hear. "Are you happy?" Dalton asked, his cheek pressed against her hair. "Is this the life you wanted?" Helena thought about the girl she had been, standing on the edges of celebrations and watching others dance, believing she would never be chosen. She thought about the bullet that had brought her to Montana and to Dalton. She thought about their children sleeping safely in the cabin, about the home they had built together in this wild and beautiful place. "This is better than anything I could have imagined," she said. "You gave me everything, Dalton. You asked me to dance when no one else ever had. You saw me when I felt invisible. You loved me when I did not think I was worthy of being loved." "You were always worthy," he said fiercely. "The world was just blind until I found you." They danced under the stars until the moon rose over the mountains, and Helena thought about how one moment of courage hers in taking his hand, his in asking, had changed everything. How a mountain man with gentle eyes had given a quiet girl the chance to discover her own strength. How love had found them both in the last place either had expected. The years continued to pass. Their children grew and eventually made their own choices. David decided he wanted to learn the timber trade and spent several years working at the mill in Williams before eventually taking over management of it. Hope, true to her nature, moved to Virginia City, where she opened a school for children and became known as one of the best teachers in Montana Territory. Matthew inherited his parents' love of the mountains and built his own cabin not far from theirs, trapping and hunting like his father had. Thomas and Margaret Oliver passed away within a year of each other when Helena was in her 40s. She grieved deeply for them, but took comfort in knowing they had lived to see their grandchildren grow, and had never doubted her choice to marry Dalton and make a life in the high country. Helena and Dalton grew older together, their hair turning gray, their bodies bearing the marks of decades of hard living, but their love never wavered. They still took walks together around the valley, though they moved more slowly now. They still danced sometimes in the evenings, though their steps were careful and measured. They still held each other every night, two people who had found home in each other's arms. Helena's old bullet wound ached on cold mornings, a reminder of the violence that had inadvertently brought her to this life. But she rarely thought of it as anything but a strange twist of fate that had led her exactly where she needed to be. When David brought his own children to visit, Helena and Dalton delighted in their grandchildren, teaching them the same lessons they had taught their own children. When Hope wrote letters from Virginia City describing her students' progress, they read them aloud to each other by firelight. When Matthew stopped by with fresh game or just to talk, they welcomed him with the warmth that had always characterized their home. They were in their 60s when Dalton's heart finally began to fail. He had always been so strong, so seemingly indestructible, that it shocked them both when he began to struggle with even simple tasks. Dr. Phillips, himself quite elderly by then, made a special trip up to the cabin to examine him. "Your heart is tired," he told Dalton gently. "You have lived a hard life and it has caught up with you. I am sorry." "How long?" Dalton asked bluntly. "Impossible to say with certainty. Months, maybe a year. You should take it easy, avoid strenuous activity." After the doctor left, Helena and Dalton sat together on the porch, looking out at the mountains that had been their home for so long. "I am not afraid of dying," Dalton said, "but I hate the thought of leaving you." "Then do not leave yet," Helena said fiercely, gripping his hand. "We have more time. We will make the most of every moment." And they did. They spent that final year in a kind of golden contentment, surrounded by their children and grandchildren. They told stories of their long life together. They watched sunsets and counted stars. They held each other through the nights and were grateful for every dawn. Dalton Jennings died on a clear autumn morning, sitting in the rocking chair he had made decades earlier, looking out at the mountains he loved. Helena was beside him, holding his hand. He squeezed her fingers one last time, smiled at her with all the love of their 40 years together, and then he was gone. Helena buried him on a hill overlooking the valley, under a tall pine tree. Their children stood with her as they lowered him into the ground, and Helena thought about how he had been such a solitary man when they met, and how he had died surrounded by love and family. She stayed in the cabin for another 5 years, refusing all offers from her children to move to town. She tended Dalton's grave every week, clearing away fallen branches and pine needles. She sat on the porch in the evenings and remembered dancing under the stars, the first time anyone had ever asked her, the mountain man who had seen her when she felt invisible. When Helena Oliver Jennings died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 68, her children buried her next to Dalton on the hill. They placed a simple marker that read, "She danced under the stars and found her home." The cabin stood for many more years, eventually becoming a place of local legend. People would hike up to see it, this place where a shy woman and a mountain man had built a life of love and courage. And on clear nights, when the stars were bright and the wind whispered through the pines, some claimed they could see 2 figures dancing in the clearing, holding each other close, moving to music only they could hear. Their story became part of Montana's history, told and retold. The girl who had never danced because no one asked, and the mountain man who took her hand and twirled her under the stars, showing her that courage and love could transform everything. That one moment of being seen, of being chosen, could change the entire trajectory of a life. And in the end, that was the truest thing about Helena and Dalton's story. Not just that they had loved each other, but that their love had been built on seeing and choosing each other every single day, through hardship and joy, through the ordinary moments and the extraordinary ones. They had created something lasting not just in their children and grandchildren, but in the very mountains themselves, a legacy of love that endured long after they were gone. The creek still ran past what remained of the cabin, singing the same song it had sung for them on their wedding night and every night after. The stars still wheeled overhead, brilliant and eternal. And the mountains stood watch, as they always had, keeping the secrets and stories of all who had made their homes in the wild Montana high country.